I always thought the end of a marriage would come with yelling, maybe broken glass or slammed doors, some grand eruption. Instead, mine ended on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee in her hand and a quiet sentence that shattered 20 years of shared life. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look angry. She just stared into her cup and said, "I'm not happy anymore, Joel. I haven't been for a long time." That was it. No specifics, no accusations, just a fact delivered like the weather. I sat across from her, my spoon suspended mid-stir in my cereal, and blinked. I didn't say anything. Couldn't. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. There's a strange kind of silence that comes when your brain is scrambling to make sense of something your heart already knows. Had I noticed it before? The late-night work meetings, the sudden obsession with yoga and self-care retreats, the locked phone, the way she laughed less at my jokes and more at texts she never let me see. I wanted to ask her 1,000 things, but instead, I just nodded. And in that moment, I realized something that scared the life out of me. I wasn't happy either. I just buried it. For years. For the kids, for the comfort, for the illusion of a perfect life. She didn't ask me to leave. She didn't even mention divorce. But the next morning, while she was still asleep, I packed a bag, wrote a note, and left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry until I was halfway down the interstate with no real destination. Just away. Felt like jumping off a cliff, but at least it was my choice. She took the first brick out of the wall, but I decided to stop building around it. What I didn't know then was that her unhappiness was more than just boredom or emotional distance. It had a name and a face and a room key. But that truth wouldn't come out until later, when I returned to the house for something I left behind and saw the car parked in our driveway. Not hers and definitely not mine. I wasn't supposed to go back. I had promised myself that when I walked out, it would be final. No lingering, no looking over my shoulder like some sad character in a drama who couldn't quite let go. But I had left behind a small wooden box, the one with my dad's medals, some letters, and the watch he gave me before he died. That box mattered to me in a way words couldn't explain, and leaving it had kept me up 3 nights in a row. So, I turned the car around and drove back. It was mid-afternoon. I knew she'd be at work. I had no plan to talk to her. I just wanted to get the box and go. But as I turned onto our street, my heart started pounding. There was a car in the driveway. A silver SUV I'd never seen before. Not her coworkers, not a neighbor's, and it wasn't parked like a guest. It was too casual, too comfortable, like it belonged there. I parked down the street and walked up on foot, trying to tell myself it was nothing. But that box of lies crumbled when I turned the corner and saw the front door was slightly open. The living room curtains were closed. That never happened during the day. My stomach twisted. I didn't knock. I didn't even hesitate. It was still my home, at least on paper. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Voices low, intimate. One of them hers, the other male and laughing. I didn't go further. I didn't need to. I wasn't trying to catch anyone in the act. The truth was already louder than anything they could say. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was physical, present. In my house, in the space where we'd raised our children, where we'd hosted birthday parties and movie nights and talked about growing old. I stepped back quietly. I didn't slam anything. I didn't yell. I just left. Heart thudding, ears ringing, and a strange, cold numbness creeping into my chest. I didn't even take the box. Back in the car, I just sat there gripping the wheel. That feeling of freefall I'd had the day I left returned, but this time with jagged edges. So she had already moved on. Or maybe she had never stopped moving in that direction. Maybe she was never unhappy alone. Maybe she was just unhappy with me. That realization burned more than I expected. Not because I still wanted her. I didn't. Not anymore. But because I felt like a fool. The worst part? I remembered how gently she had said it. "I'm not happy." Like she was the victim of some silent disappointment. Like I had failed her and this was the aftermath. But now I saw the full picture. She wasn't searching for happiness. She had already found it in someone else's arms. And all that time, I was walking on eggshells, wondering what I had done wrong. Now I knew. And I wasn't going to cry anymore. Not for her. Not for the life she broke. But the story doesn't end there. Not even close. Because a few days later, he reached out to me. And that's when things turned from painful to surreal. 3 days after I saw that unfamiliar SUV in my driveway, I received a message that made me freeze mid-bite during breakfast. I was staying at a small rental an hour out of town, trying to keep my head down and emotions steady. I hadn't spoken to anyone. Not my wife, not the kids, not even my closest friend, Marcus. I needed distance, silence, time. But my phone buzzed. And there it was, an unknown number with a short, almost casual text. "Joel, we should talk. Man to man." I stared at it for a solid minute, rereading the words like they change meaning. Man to man. I didn't recognize the number, but deep down, I knew exactly who it was. There was only one man who had any reason to text me like that. And the worst part? He wasn't even trying to hide. He didn't apologize. Didn't ask if it was okay to reach out. Just assumed I'd be ready to talk. Like we were equals in this situation. I didn't respond. But later that evening, I got another message, longer this time. "Look, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I know it's messy. I didn't come looking for trouble. She said you two were distant, that you had emotionally checked out years ago. She needed more. I was just there." Things developed. Reading those words was like swallowing broken glass. He was trying to explain away an affair like it was some accidental flat tire she'd stumbled into. As if our marriage, my life, was just collateral damage from his casual presence. What enraged me most wasn't even the betrayal itself. It was how comfortable he was with it, like he had done nothing more than help a friend through a rough patch and somehow ended up in my bed. I should have blocked the number, thrown the phone into the lake behind the rental. But I didn't. A part of me wanted to know more. I wanted to understand how long it had been going on, if my kids had met him, if they'd sat across from him at our dining table while I was working overtime to pay for school tuition and dental braces. I wanted to scream, but instead, I did the only thing I knew how to do when emotions ran hot. I drove back to the city. This time, I didn't go to the house. I went to Marcus, my best friend since freshman year of college. We hadn't talked since I left. I hadn't even told him the full story. But when I showed up on his doorstep at 10 p.m., he didn't ask questions. He opened the door, handed me a beer, and let me sit in silence. After a while, I handed him the phone and let him read the messages. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he just muttered, "What a coward. Reaches out after he's already wrecked everything." I nodded, but I felt something shift inside me. Something I hadn't felt since all this began. Clarity. Not anger, not grief. Something sharper, something cleaner. I didn't need to scream or throw punches or fall apart. I just needed truth. Real answers. Not from the man, not even from my wife, but from myself. What had I missed? How long had I been blind? And then Marcus said something that stuck with me like a nail in the wall. "You always carried her, Joel. She was just riding along." When she said she was unhappy, what she meant was she was finally ready to jump. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed on the couch, staring at the ceiling, going over every memory, every moment that suddenly felt like a lie. I realized I had been mourning the version of her I had built in my head, not the woman she had become. And the next morning, I made the boldest decision of my life. I texted the man back and said, "You want to talk? Let's do it in person tomorrow at 11 o'clock, Cafe Aurora downtown." I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to sit across from the man who helped dismantle my marriage and finally see what kind of person my wife had replaced me with. I got there early. I didn't plan to. I just couldn't sleep. The minutes crawled like hours, and by 9:30, I was already pacing the block outside the cafe. My hands were sweating. My stomach churned. I wasn't nervous in the way you'd expect. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. A sick, tight knot of curiosity and rage coiled deep in my chest. I had played this moment in my mind so many times I couldn't tell whether I wanted to punch him or just ask him one simple question. "Why did you think you had the right?" Cafe Aurora was small, dimly lit, and quiet on weekday mornings. I chose the corner table farthest from the entrance. I wanted to see him walk in. I wanted to watch his face before he saw mine. And at exactly 11:07, he entered. He looked nothing like I expected. He was maybe mid-30s, younger than me by at least 10 years. Athletic build, clean-cut beard, a smug confidence in the way he moved, like someone used to getting attention but not used to consequences. I wondered if he even realized he had just stepped into a moment that would define the rest of my life. He spotted me right away and walked over with a half-smile, like this was some awkward coffee date between rivals, not a meeting between a husband and the man who had helped destroy his marriage. "Joel," he said, sitting down without waiting to be invited. "Thanks for agreeing to this." I didn't respond. I just stared at him, taking in every detail. His wristwatch gleamed. His shirt looked expensive. There was something rehearsed about him, like he had done this before. Not just the affair, the confrontation. "So, I know this is weird," he began, his voice smooth and measured. "But I wanted to clear the air. I didn't want this to stay hostile. I respect you, man. I really do." I almost laughed. Respect. That word didn't belong anywhere near this table. He went on about how they hadn't planned to fall for each other, how it started as emotional support, how they were both in a bad place, and how I wasn't there for her emotionally. He said it like he was offering me closure, like this was some noble act of confession. I finally cut him off. "How long?" I asked. He paused. "About 9 months, he admitted. But it wasn't serious at first. 9 months, I repeated. While I was working double shifts, paying off our second mortgage, planning our 20th anniversary trip. 9 months. He looked down for a second, and that was the first real crack I saw in him. The charm slipped just a little. "I didn't come here to defend what we did," he said quickly. "I just thought you deserved to know that she wasn't being malicious. She was just lost." Lost. That was the word she had used too. Once, years ago, when she quit her job to find herself. When I held the weight of our lives so she could explore her passions. And now, apparently, she had found herself again in this man's bed. I stood up. "You didn't give me any new information," I said. "But you did give me clarity. You're not her future. You're just her escape hatch. One day you'll learn that too." He looked stunned, like he thought I'd throw a punch or break down. But I didn't. I just turned and walked out. As I stepped into the sunlight, I felt something surprising. Not peace, not yet, but strength. I had finally looked the betrayal in the eye, and I didn't flinch. He was just a man. She was just a person. And I was no longer willing to be the one bleeding in the background of their love story. But the next day, my daughter called. And the second chapter of the story, it had just begun. The next morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a name that cracked something in my chest. Maya. My daughter. My little girl who wasn't so little anymore. 17, smart, intuitive, and probably the only thing that ever kept me anchored when the marriage began to fall apart. We hadn't talked since I left. I hadn't wanted to drag her into it. Hadn't known what to say. But now, her name flashed on my screen, and my heart felt like it would crack open. I hesitated before answering. Was she angry? Hurt? Confused? Did she blame me? But when I picked up and said, "Hey, sweetheart," I heard something in her voice I didn't expect. Calmness. Not cold, not distant, just tired. "Dad," she said softly. "Can we talk? In person?" I met her at the park near our old house, the same place I used to take her for ice cream after soccer practice. She sat on the same bench she once stood on to shout that she was going to marry a firefighter and live in a castle. Now her eyes were older, heavier. She didn't hug me right away. She just looked at me and said, "I know." I blinked. "Know what?" "About Mom. About him. I knew before you did." My throat went dry. "How long have you known?" She looked away, picking at the frayed edge of her sweater sleeve. "Since Christmas. I saw them. He came over when you were working late." I didn't say anything because I didn't know what to do, and I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But then it kept happening, and she kept lying. I felt a strange mix of heartbreak and guilt wash over me. My daughter had been carrying this weight quietly while I stumbled around in denial. And worse, I realized she had been living in a house full of secrets, tiptoeing around betrayal like broken glass on the floor. She tried to make me like him, Maya said. Invited him to dinner once when you were out of town. Told me he was just a friend. But I saw how she looked at him, and he looked at her, like she was already his. I sat down beside her, silent, trying to hold myself together. She reached into her bag and pulled out something. A photo, one I hadn't seen before. The three of them, taken at some dinner I hadn't been invited to. Her smiling wide, him sitting way too close, and Maya clearly forcing the smile on her face. I took this and kept it, she said. I wanted you to know I didn't forget you. I couldn't speak. My eyes burned, and my hands trembled slightly. I wanted to tell her it wasn't her job to protect me, that none of this was her fault. But she already knew. She had grown up fast in the silence left behind by her parents' collapse. She told me she's finding herself, Maya whispered. I think she found someone else instead. Those words, they echoed what I'd heard in the cafe from the other man's mouth. She was just lost, he'd said. Funny how everyone around her was bending reality to make betrayal sound like healing. But my daughter, she saw through all of it. I finally turned to her and said, you didn't deserve this. None of it. She gave me a small, sad smile. Neither did you. And then, for the first time since I walked out of that house, I cried. Not because of my wife, not because of the affair, but because I realized how much pain my silence had caused and how much strength Maya had shown. More than either of her parents. But what she said next turned the final piece of this puzzle upside down. Dad, there's something else. I didn't just see them together. I heard something about money, about your name being used for something she never told you. My mind went numb as Maya said those words. She used your name for something. I turned toward her slowly, trying to keep my expression calm, but my pulse was pounding so hard in my ears, I could barely hear anything else. She was 17. She shouldn't have had to carry this information, but the way she looked at me, cautious but determined, told me she'd been holding it in for weeks. She didn't tell me everything, Maya began, eyes darting away. But I overheard a call. She was in the kitchen, talking in that low voice she always used when she thought I was upstairs. I only caught part of it, but she said something about refinancing the house. Using your signature. I stared at her. Using my name? How? She said. It's already done. He doesn't know. He won't until he checks the documents. Then she laughed, like it was some inside joke. I didn't understand what it meant at the time. But now, I think she did something shady, Dad. My body stiffened. The house, our home. Even when I walked out, I hadn't expected she would go as far as forging my name. But now it was all falling into place. Her sudden interest in finances, how defensive she got when I brought up bank statements, how she changed the online passwords last fall, for security reasons. I had trusted her, blinded by routine, numb from years of emotional erosion. And while I was working 12-hour days trying to keep us afloat, she was behind closed doors, signing away our future. I had to know the truth. That afternoon, I drove straight to our old mortgage broker's office. A guy named Dale who had handled our loan renewals a few years back. We weren't close friends, but he knew me well enough to recognize the tension in my voice when I asked to go over any recent documents tied to my name. He hesitated at first, citing confidentiality, but when I showed my ID and calmly said, I think my signature's been forged, he nodded and brought out a folder. What I saw inside made my skin crawl. A new agreement. Refinance papers dated just 4 weeks prior, around the time I noticed her becoming unusually secretive. It was signed by both of us, except I never signed it. I stared at the signature under my name. It was almost perfect, but the way the J curved too wide, the slightly wrong slant of the L. I knew it wasn't mine. Did you see me sign this in front of her? I asked Dale quietly. He frowned. She dropped it off. Said you were traveling, that you'd signed at home. My mouth was dry. Can I get a copy of this? He gave me a printout. My hands were shaking as I folded it and slid it into my jacket pocket. I thanked him, walked out, and sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring blankly ahead. She hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She had taken it a step further. She had used my identity to push through financial decisions behind my back. I didn't know if what she did was technically criminal, but I knew it was unforgivable. Back at the rental, I pulled up the joint bank accounts. It took me hours to reset access, recover security questions, and sort through unfamiliar transfers. But when I did, my stomach dropped. Over $47,000 had been moved. Some into her personal account, some into a new business name I didn't recognize, and some had simply vanished. She hadn't just cheated. She had cashed out. Suddenly, everything became clear. The yoga retreats, the self-discovery weekends, the new wardrobe, the unexplained consulting courses. It was all a front. She was building a life with him and funding it using the name of the man she claimed no longer made her happy. I wanted to scream, to confront her, but something in me stopped. Not because I was afraid I wasn't, but because I finally understood something crucial. I didn't want to react anymore. I didn't want to be the guy falling apart while she rewrote the narrative. I wanted to be strategic, calm, and in control. And that started with one phone call. Not to her, not to him, but to a lawyer. Because now it wasn't just about a broken marriage. Now it was about stolen identity, hidden money, and a betrayal that could no longer be contained. I'd never needed a lawyer before. Not for anything serious. I was the kind of guy who paid bills on time, never got into trouble, never imagined he'd be the one sitting across from a polished, stone-faced man in a sharp suit, laying out documents with words like fraud, civil liability, and marital asset concealment. But there I was, in a quiet, sunlit office on the 4th floor of a downtown building, feeling like I'd walked into someone else's story. Someone stupider, someone weaker. The lawyer's name was Raymond Carter, recommended by Marcus. He had this calm, calculated presence that made me feel like I was both safe and utterly exposed. After I handed him the copy of the forged refinance papers and printed bank statements, he reviewed them silently for several minutes. Then he leaned back in his chair and tapped a pen against his knuckles. "Joel," he said slowly, "if you're right, and I believe you are, this goes well beyond infidelity. This is identity fraud, financial misconduct, and potentially money laundering, depending on what that new business account is tied to." I blinked. "Money laundering?" He shrugged. "We're not saying she's done that yet. But when someone opens a business account with redirected funds and no clear operation, it raises red flags. Especially if the funds were moved from a jointly owned account without consent." He asked me for more details about her behavior when I first noticed changes, if there were other signs of secrecy. I told him everything. And when I mentioned the man she'd been seeing, the one I had met at the cafe, something in Raymond's expression changed. "What's his full name?" he asked. I paused. "David Grant." "Why?" He typed the name into his laptop, and within seconds, the screen changed. He turned it toward me. "Is this him?" There he was. A professional headshot, a short biography, and beneath it, a company name. Not one I recognized, but when I looked closer, I froze. It was the same name tied to the mystery business account the funds had gone into. Raymond looked at me carefully. "David Grant has a trail. He's registered multiple LLCs in 3 states. Most of them dissolved within a year. He's not just some guy your wife met at a retreat. He's a serial opportunist, possibly a scammer. This isn't his first affair or his first target. You're not the first husband, and you may not be the last." My jaw clenched so tight I could barely respond. All this time, I thought I was the casualty of a failed marriage. But now, it looked like I had been targeted, exploited. My wife hadn't just fallen for another man. She'd fallen into something worse, something that looked more and more like a scheme. Raymond continued, "We'll need to subpoena financial records. We'll look into her email activity, account access, digital signatures. If this man convinced her to falsify documents and move money into his accounts, she's not just guilty of betrayal. She may be a co-conspirator in financial fraud." My head spun. I come in to file for divorce. Instead, I was learning that the woman I'd built a life with had potentially committed crimes using my name, my trust, and my silence. And the man she had replaced me with, he wasn't her soulmate. He was a predator in a designer jacket. By the time I left the office, it was close to sunset. I sat in the car staring at the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even heartbroken. I was focused. For the first time in months, I had clarity, purpose. I wasn't going to shout or break things or send furious messages she could twist into victimhood. I was going to take my life back, quietly, legally, fully. But as I pulled out of the parking lot, my phone buzzed again. A number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Almost. But when I answered, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. A woman said, "Joel, it's Dana. I know this is out of nowhere, but I think you need to hear something about David Grant." Dana, my ex-fiancé. And suddenly, this wasn't just my story anymore. Dana's voice took me straight back to a different life. We hadn't spoken since our engagement broke off years ago. Amicably, but with unfinished weight. I never expected to hear from her again. But her tone wasn't casual. It was urgent, nervous. "I didn't know if I should call," she said, "but I saw your name pop up on some legal paperwork connected to David Grant. I had a bad history with him 2 years ago before I met you." Turns out, David Grant had been in her life once, briefly but destructively. He posed as a business investor back then, too. Got close to a woman she worked with, manipulated her into draining family savings, then disappeared. He never used the same name twice until recently, but she recognized him immediately from a picture her friend had shared. And when she saw my name in the court filings, she realized I was caught in the same web. It wasn't fate. It wasn't romance. It was a pattern. And my wife, she had just been his latest pawn. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I felt oddly free. Not because the truth made it better, but because it finally made sense. I hadn't lost to a better man. I hadn't failed as a husband. I'd been played, lied to, exploited, yes. But now I was finally awake. And the weight that had sat on my chest for months started to lift. I worked with Raymond for weeks after that. We filed paperwork, froze accounts, reversed the refinance using proof of forgery. Quietly and legally, I untangled myself from the mess. When she finally received the notice from my lawyer, she tried to call. I didn't answer. Her voicemails started apologetic, then turned defensive, then tearful. But I was done listening to stories that bent truth for convenience. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need to win. I needed peace. And that peace came not from hurting her, but from saving me. The divorce was finalized quietly. The court sided with the facts. I kept the house. I kept my name clear. And more importantly, I kept my dignity. She and David? Last I heard, their business folded 3 months later, and she moved out of state. I let it all go. Maya moved in with me full-time. First, it was awkward. A father and daughter rebuilding from silence and pain. But we found a rhythm. We started having Sunday dinners again, laughing over bad movies, taking long drives with no destination. She didn't just stay with me, she saved me. One afternoon, we planted a tree in the backyard, something we'd always talked about but never did. As we covered the roots in soil, Maya looked up at me and said, "I'm glad you left, Dad. Even if it hurt, I'm proud of you." That sentence meant more than anything I'd ever heard. And as I watched that little tree take root in a yard once full of ghosts, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of the life I should have had all along. One built on truth, clarity, and self-respect. She said she was unhappy. So I left, and I finally found what she never did: peace.